So this is actually a slide deck that my TA Charles Williams put together. He gave the 11 o'clock lecture today, and he was talking about how to write a good case study. He is my TA. I picked him in large part because he wrote about the best case study I saw last semester, and wanted to invite him on to be a TA in large part to help you get through this. And this is some of the advice he came up with. It's really pretty solid. His paper is really good. I hope you all had a chance to read it before today. If you did not have a chance to read it before today, you'll certainly want to read it as soon as possible after this lecture, because I'm going to be talking about the paper a lot, and so it'll be good to have those points of reference for your as you're thinking about how to write your own paper. So let's see here. The first thing you want to think about is just getting an overview of what it is that you're going to write about. That's your heaviest lift. That's your hardest problem to solve. And once you have that, you're actually already on your way to a good paper. So I want you to, as you're picking a case study. Now, by the way, somebody at the end of the last class said, "Where do you get your cases?" And the answer is blah. In the textbook, right? Business Ethics by Farrell, Friedrich, and Farrell. If you have the paper copy, and you can still get the paper copy delivered to you for $8 if you have Cengage Unlimited, which I do recommend having a paper copy on hand for that low price. You'll have to ship it back at the end of the semester. You'll be done with it though. But on the side of the book. Sorry, the background makes this a little tricky. On the side of the book, you'll note there's a sort of white-edged and yellow and green-edged pages. And the green-edged pages at the back, sort of like 40% of the book, those are your case studies. And so in your digital version, those are identified as part 5. As the cases. So, and then when you get there, you'll see case 1 is about the Volkswagen scandal. Case 2 is about Uber hits a bump in the road. Case 3 is about Wells Fargo. Don't do Wells Fargo because that's our example, right? So Charles already wrote that paper for you. So I want you to pick one of the other 19 cases. Case 4 is about Palm Wonderful, etc. 5, Monsanto. 6, Starbucks. So, the first thing you're going to want to do is just look through that list from the table of contents and say, what are about the half dozen that are of potential interest to me? What are about the half dozen that are of potential interest to me, right? If you read all of the cases before you get started, it's going to take you forever because each one is like 10 pages of really dense text. That's not a great use of your time to just read 20 pages, to read 20 cases in depth like that. At least read through the Wells Fargo case by way of helping you understand Charles's paper. But you're really going to want to start with the question more than anything. And then once you narrow your focus, then you're going to outline your ideas. We'll talk about how to outline your ideas. He's got a lot of good detail in here about how to do that. And then you're going to determine your research needs. You're going to find your sources. You're going to develop your citations. You're going to fill out your outline with your research. Then you're going to draft and revise your paper. And then once you've revised, once you're at the point where your revisions are getting to the point of proofreading, where you're just making it look pretty, that's the end of the process. First, picking a case. Again, look for familiarity and think about what you know. So if you are... if you're familiar with the Herbalife story, you're like, oh yeah, I read a couple things about Herbalife. Maybe that's one of the cases you want to consider writing about. If you're a regular Whole Foods shopper, then maybe you want to do the Whole Foods case. Or I know we have a couple folks at MSU Denver who work at Whole Foods. If you're a finance major and you're really interested in finance, maybe case number 13, insider trading at the Galleon Group. Okay, that's the type of stuff that's of interest to me as a future financier of the world. So literally just look through the list of cases and think about which ones are of potential interest to you, and just think about what it is that you know. Right, and then read the questions. So step 1 is read the questions. Don't read the cases until you've read the questions. So at the back of each case, before the references, you're going to see a list of 3 discussion questions for each case. And I want you to figure out which of those questions, which one or more of those questions are of potential interest to you, because that's what you're committing to. You're committing to answering one of the questions as phrased in the book. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. Most cases, you're not going to want to answer all three questions. Most cases, you're only going to want to zoom in on one question. Now, Charles picks three questions. I was not clear enough about this last semester, but let me be super extra incredibly clear with you. You're for most of these cases and for most of you, you're going to want to answer one question. You're going to want to answer one question. So if you read the back of the case and you read the questions, you're like, two of these questions are garbage. I don't want to talk about that at all. But one of the questions is of interest to you. That's great. You can write a whole essay about this question. Any one of all 60 of these questions. There's 20 cases with 3 questions each. That's 60 total questions. Any one of those 60 questions could get you a good 4-page paper if you do the work. Right. And very few of the cases, Wells Fargo is one of the few actually, where all 3 questions really work together, where answering all 3 in the same essay will make a lot of sense. So I want you to read the questions and look for, and start by thinking about one question that you would want to answer. And as long as there's at least one question you'd want to answer, then you're maybe in business. And that's when you would then read the case and take notes. Right? And then be ready to answer the question or the questions. You might also want to answer 2 questions. It doesn't have to be 1 or 3. You can also answer 2 questions. A lot of you, for a lot of these cases, there's at least 2 of the questions that kind of go well together reasonably well. And so you may want to answer 2 of the questions if you think that'll make for a better 4-page essay. Yeah. So again, you don't need to answer I want to make this really big. You don't need to answer every question. For some cases, it will be best to choose one only. For some cases, you might choose 2. Some cases, you might choose all 3. Those are all equally legitimate options. What the question you have to answer is, the thing you have to decide is answering 1, 2, or 3, which leads to the best essay. And for most essays, it's probably actually going to be one question. And so here's a little bit about what Charles did. This is like an insider view of what his thinking process was when he did this. He saw the Wells Fargo case. He was like, "Oh, I'm interested in that." He read the case. He started reading the case, and then as he was looking at the question, as he was looking at the answers to the questions, he just got some basic preliminary answers. Right. 1, how did Wells Fargo focus on short-term gains, violate the duties they owed to customers, regulators, and employees? And the answer is that they violated trust and they violated the law. But he also makes a note to himself, I need to find some info on this, right? So the case gives you some sense of how this happened, but he's going to have to find a lot more specific info on it. The second question, describe how the Wells Fargo scandal demonstrates that organizational leaders must not only establish goals, but ensure that those goals are being acted upon properly. And just his quick note is that the goals were established, but the way that they were established left room for error. And question 3 says, why are ethical values useless unless they are continuously reinforced? And his first thought on that is that interpretations of what is right changes with the culture and must be translated for every employee and ingrained into the daily work. So as he's starting to answer these questions, he's got a quick answer for each of them. And so as you might imagine, if he's answering all 3 questions, those are his 3 main points. And so what he's starting to develop here is a sense of what each of those points are going to make, what point he's going to make with each of those main points. And these are already even rough. They're not the final version that he comes out with, but these are already a rough version of the topic sentence that he has for each of those main points, right? Which is like the thesis for each subsection of the essay, right? So his first main point is that Wells Fargo violated consumer trust and the law. His second main point is that Wells Fargo established ethical goals, but failed to reinforce them or left room for error in the way that they implemented them. And the third main point is that the interpretations of what is right changes, and they have to be translated for every employee. So you can imagine an essay with that sentence at the start of each of those three main points and how that starts to hang together and look like a pretty good essay, just based on a quick answer for each of those questions. Now, if you're going to answer one question, then you're going to have to develop separate main points for that answer. If you're going to answer two questions, then two main points might not be enough. One main point might justify one question might justify two separate main points, or they both might justify two separate main points. But as you answer the questions, this is how you start to develop your thesis and your main points. And once you've done that, once you've read the case, you've taken the notes, you've taken the notes, and you've got some preliminary answers about what it is that you want to say underneath each of these main points, that is when you start to outline the paper. That is when you start to outline the paper. And I want you all literally to do this either on a notepad or a notebook next to, or a blank sheet of paper, right? I like to use paper from the recycling bin and just flip it over and use the blank half sometimes. So you can either do it on a physical piece of paper or write in Microsoft Word. I want every one of you to write out a physical outline. Now, the advantage of doing it in Word is that once you've got the outline in Word, then you can take that outline and then save it as a different document as your paper, and then just start to fill in the outline right underneath it, right, all within Word. Right. But as you do that outline, you're going to have to think about, okay, so we've got the point where we're at the point where we've got our answers, at least on a preliminary basis, that lead to our main points, or we've got a sense of what our main points are going to be, at least on a preliminary basis. So the next thing you're going to have to say is, okay, I need to think about what kind of information I need. I need to think about what kind of information I need underneath these main points. And that means determining the kinds of sources that you're going to use. Right. Now, periodicals, newspapers, magazines, trade publications, newspapers, magazines, and trade publications. These are your bread and butter. These are your bread and butter sources for what happened on in a historical timeline with your company. These are your bread and butter sources for the fundamentals of what happened with your company as the events in the case unfolded. Right. So who was the CEO of Wells Fargo? Well, a newspaper is going to tell me that. Right. What was their policy on creating an ethical culture at Wells Fargo, and how did that get violated? Right. When did the falsely created accounts, when did that problem start? When was it caught? What happened after it was caught? What did the investigation conclude about who was responsible? All of those answers, that's going to be like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, your trade publications from, in these databases, you're going to see trade publications. Like in this case, you'd want like banking trade publications, as well as your news magazines, your Newsweeks of the world. They're going to tell you what happened. They're going to tell you what happened in a historical narrative sense. Now, like the mean person that he is, Professor Herman has also told you that you have to have another kind of source that's harder to find, harder to use, and requires a little bit more of a stretch to apply to something like this essay, and that's academic sources. And by academic sources, I mostly mean journals. Now, if you happen to find a book that's from an academic trade press, either, like Cengage, like Routledge, but also from, the university presses, Oxford University, Harvard University, University of California, right? Any university press or an academic publisher, which is a publisher that you've associated with textbooks, anything published by any of these people, a book that's published by any of these people is also probably going to count as an academic source. But I didn't put books here. I didn't put books here because for a paper of this size, books are overkill. Books are overkill. They're harder to find. It's harder to, especially, I mean, our library is, I'm unsure whether they're actually open for you just wandering around in the stacks right now. Right. And if they're not, you got to go to the library and say, and log in and say, I need this book. Can you give it to me? And then you got to wait for 3 days for them to produce it and then go pick it up. That's not worth the effort. But even not COVID, is it worth going into the stacks looking for books? No. I've written a book. I've read many academic books. They're incredibly detailed and hard to find the relevant information that you're in, unless you're an experienced researcher, unless you're a seasoned researcher. Now, I have a lot of books behind me. I use them in my research, but I'm producing 25-page journal articles, right, where I'm having conversations with other scholars who've looked at this stuff for decades. That's not the level of the problem you're at. You're trying to get a quick hit 4-page in and out paper. That's 4 pages, including the intro and the conclusion, right? So the level of detail, the level of history, the level of specificity that's in a book is not helpful to you. Instead, what I want you to do is I want you to find academic journals, ideally in the business disciplines, where you're going to find some law reviews in some of these searches. Law reviews also, I mean, each law review article tends to be like a novella. They're like 80 pages, or sometimes they could be 120 pages long. That's ridiculous. Yeah, you don't need to read that much. You're looking for 10, 15-page journal articles that lay out a broader set of principles, a broader set of theories, where your case is an example in a broader trend. Right. So to go to, where's Charles's paper here? I'm going to have to dig that out. Right. So in Charles's study, if you just go to the back, right, we've got Kaviko and Bahoutin, right? That's the SM Advanced Management Journal. Okay, that's great. That's an academic journal, because it's published by an academic society for the Advancement of Management. It's called Wells Fargo's Fake Account Scandal and its Legal and Ethical Implications for Management. Ideally, you will go find a journal article with scholars, professors or advanced grad students talking about your case in some detail. That's the ideal find for you. But it doesn't have to be that on the nose either. It can be something like, let's see here. In the Journal of Values-Based Leadership, right, William Mumley talks about organizational culture and ethical decision-making during major crises, right? So what are some of the factors that contribute in an organization to allowing unethical behavior to fester? This isn't about Wells Fargo, it's about broader systems and principles, and Wells Fargo can be an example that you then tie to the theory and the principles that Mumley finds. So ideally, for your sake, you find something like the Kaviko and Bahoutin article that's literally on the nose for your case, but it doesn't have to be that on the nose. It can just be something that's more broadly related to the broad principles and the broad trends and theories that are happening, a theory of the kinds of behaviors that are happening, as an example in your case study.
A quick question.
Simonis, yes.
I was wondering, in the past, I've used the Congressional Research Service. They do kind of like research articles. Does that be considered under the journals, even though it's not published under a journal?
So the Congressional Research Service is absolutely a valid source. It's definitely a valid source, and if you can find a CRS report that talks about your case, I think that's an excellent addition to your sources. That's going to be much more useful to you than like one newspaper article or one magazine article. But I really want to push you all to include at least 3 scholarly sources for which that doesn't quite count, because they're professional researchers, but they're not really scholarly in the sense that it's not It's not a professional discipline based person who's writing about that stuff. So CRS researchers, this is some inside baseball stuff. CRS researchers are folks who tend to be more like master's level students, folks who have a master's degree but not a PhD, and they're sort of generalists and can go in and research lots and lots of things. And so the authors of that aren't really, I mean, they become reasonably expert in it by the time they're done with it, but they're not really publishing original research. And I want you to go find original research by scholars for at least 3 of your sources. But if you find CRS and use that as one or 2 of your sources, if there's 1 or more reports that are applicable there, that's fantastic. As long as it's current enough that it reflects on what happened or the run up to what happened or something. Or I mean, like a CRS report from 2002 is probably not going to be that helpful to you, but something. But that is a great source. I do like that a lot, and I myself have used them several times.
Thank you.
Excellent. And then there are other types of information, and these are supporting, and they're valuable, but they're not. I mean, your bread and butter is right here. Your bread and butter is right here. Periodicals and journals. And if you've got 8 helpful periodicals and 3 or 4 good journal articles, you're over your total, and that you've done all the research you have to do. As long as you're probably going to have to find like 20 or 25 periodicals for the 6 or 8 that you'll actually use. And you'll probably have to look at 10 or 15 journal articles, at least look at the title and the abstract before you find the few that you're actually going to use in your paper, right? So don't just stop at a total of whatever I said the minimum was, 8 and a minimum of 3 journal articles. Don't just use the first few that you find just to get to that total. Look for the ones within that number that are the most relevant for your stuff. And if this is all you have, if all you have is periodicals and journals in your references, you are done. You can be done. You can stop here. This is fine. This is fine. These are the important ones. There's some other ones that can be of some use to you, that I want you to use sparingly, but which can support your work. Right. And those include opinions or interviews, right? Stats, right? Those could be government or agency stats. Those can also be, sometimes you pull up a page from like Statista or something like that. And that's a subscription service, so sometimes it's not available. But for the ones that are available to you, we don't subscribe to it. It's terribly expensive. Right. So like, 1 or 2 from these sorts of things, fine, that's good, right? And opinions and interviews are often going to appear in periodicals. Right. So the New York Times has an opinion section. The Denver Post has an opinion section. Right. So it might be the editorial board that's writing. It might be a regular writer for that periodical. That's often called an op-ed. So like Paul Krugman is an op-ed writer for the New York Times. He doesn't work for they pay him for his opinion, but that's it. That's the only relationship he has with them. He doesn't do independent, like regular journalistic reporting, that sort of thing. These can be helpful. These can be useful. But they're not your bread and butter. These are not making your article. These are not the strongest, most helpful things that are really building your article in the strongest way, right? Anything other than sort of straight news reporting from a periodical or academic journals, just use it in a supporting role. Don't depend too heavily upon it. And as you're going through these, you'll notice that sorry, I keep bumping my microphone. You'll notice in the last slide we talked about having an outline at least in mind. Now you're not glued to it. You can change. You can evolve your outline as you do your research. You can evolve your outline as you learn more about your case. So your outline may change. That's okay. Sometimes that's a good thing. If your outline, if what you think is going to be your answer evolves, is like, oh, as I do the research, actually it's different a little bit or a lot in this way or that way for this particular point. That's good. That's mature research. That's what you should be doing. Right. But as you have at least an idea of what your outline is going to look like, when you're going in to do the research, always be thinking about where in the outline does this information fit? Where in my outline does this article fit? Where in my outline does this news story fit? And if it doesn't fit in your outline, and you're not going to change your outline because you found that, like, oh, that's huge, I have to talk about that, I'm going to scrap this whole main point and use this other main point instead based on just this finding, right? Unless it's going to change your outline. If it doesn't fit in your outline and you're not going to make it fit in your outline, then you just set it aside. Just set aside. There's lots of interesting stuff out there. You could research any one of these questions long enough to write a book out of, right? You don't have to know everything, every potential angle that you could come up with. Just think about what's the best, most efficient use of my time in terms of finding sources that help me fill out this paper. And once you have an outline, that's a pretty easy question to answer. And as you're outlining the paper, do your basic journalistic thing: who, what, when, where, and why. Right. Who did what to who, when, where, and why. But also step back and ask, what if? What if? What if Wells Fargo had a better ethical education program? Right? What if, let's see. What if Wells Fargo hadn't been caught? Right? What if Wells Fargo had structured their incentives program differently? If you're going to say that Wells Fargo's incentives program caused or contributed to this crisis, then what you're really saying is that if their incentives program had been different, if it had been structured in a different way, then the crisis might not have happened. Right? So I want you always to be thinking about, what if things had been different? What if so if you're saying A caused B, event A led to event B. What if event A had not happened? If not A, then maybe not B. In fact, if not A, the stronger your paper, the more persuasively you're going to be able to argue that if the things had been different that you're identifying, then things really would have been different as an outcome. So always be thinking about, what if things had been differently? In addition to what did happen, what if things had been different? And then what likely would have happened instead? And what's your evidence for that? What's your evidence for that? Maybe you have an academic scholar saying the companies that have good systems of control along the lines of X, Y, and Z don't have these kinds of problems. And Wells Fargo didn't have that. So that's how we got to these problems. Okay, so when you're outlining the paper, after you've started to outline the paper and you've determined your needs, then start looking at that outline as a hint for keywords. Right? Read the case, write down notes, and then start thinking about what are the. So if I just go to the a database and just type in Wells Fargo, I'm going to get a million responses. I'm going to get a million hits. That's not helpful to me. So how do I narrow that down? How do I narrow that down so that I get better results? And to illustrate that, let's go. I'm going to go ahead and hold on. Let me just see something real quick. No, do the research is a little bit later. So we'll get to that in a bit. Okay. So how do you outline the paper? For those of you who've not outlined a paper, right? Think about your thesis, and then think about your one sentence answer to either, again, if you're going to answer all three questions, your answer to question 1 is your first main point. Your answer to question 2 is your second main point. Your answer to question 3 is your third main point. If you're going to answer one question, great. What are the main points I'm going to deploy to answer that question? Right. So main point 1, main point 2, main point 3, main point 4, if applicable. You generally want about 3 main points. 2 can be done. 4, it gets a little crowded in a paper of this length. 5 is way too many. And then, just for good form, start your conclusion by restating your thesis. So if you can't write it in subtly different ways twice, right? Write it one way and then say the same thing with somewhat different words. Maybe you're not so clear on the point it is that you're trying to make in this essay. So just start here. Just start here. This is enough of an outline for now. And you know what KISS stands for, right? Keep it simple, scholar. So here's what Charles's outline started to look like. His thesis had the CEO, John Stumpf, understood the effects of ignoring the behavior of management teams globally and not pressured unrealistic sales goals on subordinate managers, there would be no incentive to fuel the scandal. Right? And so in his body, he really actually has two main points, because the definition of what counts as unethical here in A, as well as the top-down pressure that comes from that comes from above based on those incentives, those really kind of get lumped together into what are the ethical challenges. And then, so what's a company to do? That's it. That's his second main point, right? The standards reward, and then he fixes it and change how the rewards are the incentives are structured, and then fix the system from the top down. And you'll notice that this evolved. This changed from an answer to each question is your main point to actually I have two main points and two of the questions collapse together. So your outline can evolve. That's fine. We're okay with an evolving outline. And then his conclusion, which should sound very familiar, says, by changing the corporate culture from the top down and with more care towards the impact on the behavior and treatment of employees, they will continue to provide service to customers brave enough to trust them again. Right. And then he says, this should have been like a parenthetical or in brackets, right? Roughly restated my introduction. Right. So now we do the research. Before we do, any questions so far about the outlining process?
Is it all right if we add some, like, I guess, flair to the introduction? Because I like to usually kind of like hook people in.
Thank you, Chris. That's right. So I'm assuming the answer to the question, which is built into your question, which is absolutely the right strategy. And thank you for stopping me so that I unpack this. Right. The first sentence is not your thesis. The last sentence is not your thesis. The thesis is the last sentence of the introduction and the first sentence of the conclusion. But before you get started in the paper, in the heart of the paper with the thesis and stuff, tell me a story. Grab my attention. Right. Give me a shocking statistic, right? Like between 2014 and 2016, Wells Fargo agents created, 11 gajillion fake accounts in the names of their customers, right? That's okay. You have my attention. You have my attention, right? One customer named so-and-so is on the record saying, quote, I had no idea that this account was even out there. And then I went to apply for a mortgage and I found out, and oof, all of a sudden I realized that I've been a victim of identity fraud, identity theft. I got really scared, but when I found out that the identity thief was Wells Fargo, my fear turned to anger. Oof, you have my attention. You have my attention. And so grab my attention by grabbing some subset of the story in the form of like one person's story or a big statistic or both, like I just did, and then reach out and add what Chris called flair. Add some of your own dramatic writing to start the paper. That's absolutely the way to go. And then build that down to the thesis. And then tell me in one sentence what it is that you're gonna talk about. And I oversimplified it a little bit by saying that the last sentence of your introduction should be your thesis. The last thing you should do actually is give us a thesis and then a preview of what your main points are going to be. right? So Wells Fargo, Wells Fargo acted unethically in ways X, Y, and Z because they had a lack of corporate controls. Like if that's my thesis, right? I will demonstrate this by first identifying how the lack of controls deliberately contributed to the Wells Fargo scandal. Two, how the theory of how academic research on corporate controls illustrates what should be done, right? And then you could, feel free to make a whole main point just to cram in all your academic sources. That's okay, as long as it's part of a cohesive essay, right? And then three, I'll talk about how other banks that had these types of controls implemented didn't have these kinds of scandals. Right? And then that preview tells us what your main points are going to be. And then just go tell me what those main points are as you're going through and develop those main points. And then at the end, in the conclusion, remind me of what the thrust of the whole essay was, and then recap each of those main points real quick. And then at the end of the conclusion, bring me back to the flair or the individual story that you started the essay with. Thank you, Chris. Excellent question. Okay, then it's time to do the research. Right. First, you want to take notes as you go. Right, now you want to use paper sometimes. Some of you are really real fans of using paper or sticky notes. That's fine, but do so cautiously. Do so cautiously, right? Because if you're anything like me, sometimes you get a little disorganized. You're not sure what happened to that sticky note. It's part of a big pile of sticky notes or pieces of paper, right? You don't want to have this problem. So make sure you know where your notes are. And if you're quick hit going through the research, making quick notes and so on, as you're doing that, also think about, like, if you know where it goes in your essay, right? Keep a copy of I'm a big fan of making like 15 different copies of a document. So I'm tinkering with it just so I can say, oh, this one stinks. I want to go back a version or go back 2 versions. So as long as you're doing something like that, there's no harm in just taking quotes, and then making a quick note about your source to go with that quote, or an idea, and then a note about the source to go with that idea, and then just throwing that right in your outline, right in Word. And then that's what I mean by type your findings directly into the outline under each heading or subheading, and then include the name of the source with the text in parentheses. You don't have to have the full citation as you're writing it, because you don't know if you're going to use it in the final version yet anyway. But don't take a quote from an article and throw it in your paper, and then in 5 days have to go figure out where that quote came from. I've done that. It's not fun. Do not get into that problem. Make sure you identify where those sources came from as you're bringing those into your Word document. By the way, if you want to see the video that this picture is taken from, he's got that in the notes here. I'll throw the slides online with the video, so you can do that. It's about, as you might guess, this person parked illegally in a handicap zone, and this is the protest that he got in response, which I think is a cute, pain in the tuchus, but ultimately harmless response to somebody who does something like that. So how do we get these sources? Well, the one and only source you're going to need, you're going to need, is the MSU Denver Library. He's got the link here, but it's real simple: library.auraria.edu. If that's not already in your search history, I'm a little disappointed, but it's going to be starting now. library.auraria.edu. Is that a good size? Can you see that pretty clearly? I literally have a 32-inch monitor here. So like what I can see and like what looks good for you are not the same thing. So this is, so I just go here and type Wells Fargo? No, do not do that. Do not do that. We're not going to go anywhere and just type Wells Fargo, but let's go, let's at least go to a more specific place for that. So click on databases. And you can either search by keyword or browse by title. Well, we're interested in business stuff, so give me all the business databases. Now, if you want to learn more background about your company, something like the business collection or business insights essentials, these are helpful, but these are just background information. This is the kind of stuff like go read up on your company, but don't even use this stuff in your paper. Like that's the level of background stuff that it's better than Wikipedia. It's better. Not that Wikipedia is bad. Wikipedia is also useful, right? But look at the sources that Wikipedia links to instead of expecting that to be the definitive source. But I recommend actually reading the case as your background information and then jumping right here to look for your sources. If there's one place you're going to look, I recommend this right here, Business Source Premier. You will have to log in. So, go to number 3 here. So on page 362 in the Wells Fargo case, I want to give you an example of looking for keywords. Here, let me just I'll do it badly first. Do not do this. This is an example of what not to do. I'm going to show you why. Okay, I'm interested in the Wells Fargo. Okay, let's just look up Wells Fargo. $19,649 sources. Is that manageable? Is that going to help us?
No.
I'm not a big fan. I'm not a big fan. Now you might luck out, and as happened here, you might have a couple of good sources, right? The Busted Stagecoach, maybe that's okay. That's a periodical. That's not especially helpful. But here we have an academic journal, paradoxical timelines in Wells Fargo's crisis discourse, expanding the discourse of renewal theory, right? Well, the International Journal of Business Communication. All of a sudden, like if I'm interested in how is Wells Fargo going to talk about renewing themselves, maybe that's helpful. That's still probably not the paper that you're going to write based on these questions. So we're still not super lucky yet. So, okay, so what am I going to do? Wells Fargo, and so on page 362, we're under situation, it says, September 2016 marked the unfolding of Wells Fargo's entanglement in a widespread scandal that would implicate several high-level executives and thousands of employees. On September 8th, the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which came out of the 2008 crisis, the Los Angeles City Attorney, and the Office of the Controller of Currency levied a massive $185 million fine against Wells Fargo. Wow. Okay. So I want to know about that $185 million fine. So it might say 185 million, or it might say 185 million. I don't care about those. $185 will get me into stories that talk about that fine specifically. Right. So Forbes.com periodical, where talk about negative consequences, $185 million fine. That's a big hit to their bottom line, right? Or that they are fined $185 million without customers' knowledge, right? Here we are. In the wake of that, now we have something really relevant. Internal audit, fraud, and risk management at Wells Fargo. Academic journal. Academic journal. That's probably going to be one of my 3 because I know it's going to be super relevant. Right? Or we've got a case study here. So those start to answer when we add in relevant keywords that start to drill down, that's when we start to find really good sources in terms of helping me answer a specific question. Or let's say I'm okay, great. I'm interested in having some history of how that fine got levied and what the fine was about. But I'm also interested in how corporate governance led to that outcome. So instead of the fine, let's also change our keywords over a little bit to be looking at corporate governance. I'm doing this live, by the way. I didn't do any of this before class. You're watching me discover this at the same time that you're discovering it. Great. A case study of corporate governance failures. Oh. When you see a source like this, from an academic journal, that's probably worth reading in some detail and then resisting the temptation to just pull like 15 different quotations from this one source into your paper, because it's actually supposed to be balanced based on looking at all your different sources. So this one is so on the nose, it's going to be hard not to plagiarize from this one, just by tinkering with my keywords a little bit. We could also, so apparently it automatically applies related words. So it doesn't have to be governance per se. Complex compliance investigations. Okay, so Wells Fargo is going to be just an example here, but Columbia Law Review though, that's going to be a bit challenging. Again, law reviews, they're great. This is a small book, I'm sure. So yeah, page 249 to 307. That's 58 pages, and they're like journal article pages. So that's like almost 100 pages worth of word writing. It's a lot. I don't think you want to read something that long. But you'll notice as I'm browsing through here, I'm kind of saying, okay, what kind of source is it? Periodical, academic journal, etc. Let's say that this number is really big. It's like 350, 400, 500. And like, I know that's a good keyword and that's narrowed it down enough, but I want to make sure, okay, that's fine. I can just sort of pick and choose enough of the news sources to get me through what I'm looking for. But I'm really looking for those scholarly journals. I'm interested in that. And because I want them, let's say I want to specifically only want to look at the ones that reference this scandal. Well, the scandal happened in 2016, so let's limit that to 2016. Now we're down to 7 sources. Now, do I want you reading 7 academic journal articles, right, to get to the 3 that you're going to cite? No. Can I expect you to read 7 abstracts? Yes. Yes, that's a very reasonable ask. Right. So we look at the case study, right? Complex compliance investigations, clawback provisions. Oh, that'd be fun. I'm interested to see what that has. Right. The analyst roundtable on integrating environmental, social, and governance into investment decision making. Right. So here we have. This is going to be much more theoretical, and they're going to talk about, how do we make these decisions in general? How do we implement these systems in companies in general? And then Wells Fargo is going to be just an example of that. So that also, in a lot of ways, is really helpful. Let's say just anything referencing Wells Fargo after 2016 in scholarly journals. That also could be, okay, now I've got 102. That's still a bit much. What other keywords could you try to narrow that down? So zoom in, zoom out, zoom in, zoom out. Play with your keywords, play with your limiters, right? You probably, to save time, if there are 100 journal articles in this database, that talk about Wells Fargo, right? You could probably just say, well, okay, I want to limit it to the ones that are full text in this database. Now we've got it down to 32. That's pretty fast. Or if you imagine there's one that you find that's not in this database, right? So let's say, uncheck that. Teaching case, together we'll go far. So here where it says check 360 link for full text, you can click on that. I opened it in a new tab over here. Oh, we don't have it. That's too bad. So you'd have to request it from another library. But some of these, they're going to have it just in a different database. And so just because it's not in Business Source Premier doesn't mean that we don't have the full text version of it. Oh, look at this. We've got performance improvement, the journal. So then I just have to go back here and say, where'd it go? February 2018, volume 57. Right, that's right here. So then I just have to go back over here and say, okay, well, give me volume 57. Then you click on that, and then you find the which issue is it? Issue 2. And then you click on that, and it's going to be in here instead of Business Source Premier. So we have a bunch of different databases. Each database has a different mix of which articles they have, which in full text versus which ones they just have the abstracts for. So just because it's not, if there's an article that's like, oh, that's a really good article, I really want that article, it can be worth clicking on that link to see if it's in a different database that our library might have. You can also just go to the homepage of the library, type in the name of the article, type in the name of the journal, go to the journal list and look up the name of the journal and see if it's in there that way as well. For most of you, you'll be able to get most, if not all of the sources you need though, just based on stuff that's available full text just in this one database. Right? And there's no, for a paper this length, there's no need to have absolutely the perfect source if 2 good enough sources are in there that'll answer the same questions. Okay, I'm not trying to take your whole semester from you. I know you've got other classes. I know most of you have jobs, etc. Okay. So that's how to look it up in the library. And then I'm not going to have time to talk about this today, but I also recommend getting a citation manager. As juniors, you have enough college left to make it worth your time for doing this for most of you. And you're gonna save enough time. You're gonna save enough time, just over 3 different case studies, to make it worth figuring out how to install a citation manager. I use Zotero. It's super handy. Here's my database. So like I've got, I mean, you can see, I mean, again, I'm a professor, so I have a million things here, right? But just within CSR and ethics, right? So corporate social responsibility, media and technology, I can make little subfolders here, right? Ethical culture and leadership, stakeholder theory. I've got a bunch there, right? And then I use this to organize my references. And then, okay, toward a descriptive stakeholder theory, Jawahar and McLaughlin. And then I double click on it, and there it is, boom. I've got the PDF right there. Now you've got to get it in there. Once you get used to doing this, it's fine. I'm going to throw, I'm going to try to find a video on how to use Zotero that's like 10, 15 minutes long. If I can't find it, I will make it. I'll put that online there for you real quick. But if you just go to zotero.org, download, follow the instructions, get the plugin for Word, get the plugin for your browser, then what happens is I'm in here, right? And then I just hit this plugin, save to Zotero, and Zotero will go get that article, put it in my library, and it'll get all the information about the article. And then when I go to cite it in Word, I just use the Zotero plugin in Word and say, hey, cite this one article that I used, and it puts a citation in text, and then it'll add that citation in the bibliography at the bottom as well. It's super slick. It's like magic. It'll save, I promise you it'll save time. But speaking of time, we have the rest of sort of the whole process to get through here. When in doubt about how your citation should look, I recommend Purdue OWL. That stands for Online Writing Lab. They have definitive, they have super quick hit, easy ways of what should this MLA citation look like? What should this APA citation look like? What should the Chicago citation look like? Now, always make sure you check the context of your information. Right? Make sure you record and cite what it is that you're doing as your research. Not taking notes about where you got that information while you're doing your research is a great way to accidentally commit plagiarism. We don't like plagiarism. That's going to lead to an uncomfortable conversation with Professor Herman. We don't want that. Professor Herman doesn't want that either. Right? Record and cite your research as you're writing, and then sort your information. You want to be gathering facts and thinking about where in your essay does this go as you're reading stuff in the database. And then when it's time to write the paper, with your first draft, right? Again, before you even begin, what have you learned? What's your mind, frame your mind, get ready to think about what it is that you're going to argue, and then refer to the answers of each question, right? What is your overall thesis? And then what is and how does that answer the question or the questions that you've been asked? That is the driving force of this essay, is giving a well-argued answer to one of these questions. And when it comes to framing your mind, getting your mind in a framework, somebody asked last time, should I really have an opinion here? Yes. Yes. You want to have a strong, well-evidenced opinion that drives the paper. You want to have a strong, well-evidenced opinion that drives the paper. Right. Question 2 is, describe how the Wells Fargo scandal demonstrates that organizational leaders must not only establish goals, but ensure that those goals are being acted upon appropriately. Right. If you're going to, now it's a leading question. It's not exactly the way I'd phrase the question, but if you're going to answer that question, you're going to be taking on the role of somebody who's arguing that organizational leaders must establish goals and must ensure that those goals are being acted upon appropriately. If you're going to take on that question, you pretty much are taking on the obligation to make that argument. Then make that argument. Express an opinion that is true. Which is not the same thing as coming out and saying Wells Fargo is garbage. Wells Fargo is a den of iniquity, right? Like, no, you're not. That's not the thesis that you're saying. That's not the level of opinion that you have, right? Your opinion should be more specific and more refined, but it should be a statement of opinion that is well argued and is well justified by the evidence that you produce. Right. So when you're writing it all down, when you're putting it all down, write what comes to mind. He went and found this image, and it just made me laugh, because like, that's such a good metaphor for what it is that you're doing. You're just trying to fill it up, man. You're just trying to fill it up and say, where are the spots that need more water? Right. And this is, you have other stuff to do. You have other stuff to do. Don't let this essay consume your whole existence. People who find out that I'm a professor, a lot of times will say, "Hey, help me out. I'm working on this essay." And sometimes and sometimes my students will come to me too and say, "Hey, I'm working on this essay, and here's the problem I'm facing." And like, okay, where are you at? Okay, well, in my 5th draft, like, let's maybe get a couple down. And then, so your first draft, just think about it, what's your outline, and then how do I fill in all these blanks? And don't backtrack. Just get one workable draft together, and then tinker. As your second draft, this could be a brand new copy or the third or fourth iteration, right? Because you could have an outline that's like sort of like draft 0, and then maybe draft 0.5 is the second version of the outline as you've been doing the research. Your opinion of what it is that you're going to say kind of evolves. You might even decide, you know what, I'm not even going to answer that other question. I'm just going to stick to one question, even as you're writing your outline. Great, fine. Then what are your main points, right? So you're going to have a different iteration at that point. So the second full draft of a paper it doesn't necessarily have to be just only the second thing, the second iteration that you've done, right? Scrapping your first thoughts is okay, but it's the situation is time sensitive. So once you've written one complete draft, it's going to be much better if you just tinker with that and work on improving it from there. You can drag and drop info from your first draft under each heading. And if you don't need it, cut it. If you don't need it, cut it. I struggle with this all the time. I'll have, and especially when you're talking about longer papers, right? I'll like, oh, that paragraph is great. That sentence is awesome. This fact is lovely. Cool, great. Is it helping you prove your point? If it's not helping you prove your thesis, cut it. You don't need it. Cut it. You don't need it. And then find the spots where you don't have enough proof, and then go find that argument to make, find that source to cite. With your second draft, you should be finalizing your thesis. Come through and label your headings. They don't have to be, nothing's carved in stone yet. And then write your conclusion once your draft is coherent. And here's a trick from a lot of established nonfiction writers that I bequeath to you absolutely free. A lot of times, even your introduction, you shouldn't be writing it until you've really written the heart of your essay. Oh, come on. I think I skipped one. Yep. Okay. When you're revising and proofreading, where you spend your time should be much more on content, style, and correctness. Factually correct. Right? The style being straightforward, clear, easy to read. The content being well argued, well evidenced. All of the ideas and facts and let alone quotes that you got from somewhere else are correctly cited. Right? All of that stuff is much, much more important than grammar and spelling. Much more important than grammar and spelling. If you have, 5 glaring spelling errors and 3 or 4 verb noun mismatches, I'm good. I'm not your English I'm not your English professor. I have different things that I'm trying to emphasize. Now that might make the difference between an A- and an A+, but let's work on getting you to the A- level first. And that's going to come from good content with good evidence based on good research that hangs together and makes a good argument. With a style that is straightforward and is readable, and where everything is correct, everything is tight, everything is factual, every factual claim you make is true, and every conclusion you draw is based on well-reasoned premises. Okay? So if this is a fight between these two types of proofreading, I want fighter number 1 to win here. And then maybe after fighter number 1 has won the bout so thoroughly, get fighter number 2 off the mat and say, okay, let's work with you a little bit. So each paragraph should be one thought. It can be a long thought or a short thought. If it's a short thought, then it should be a short paragraph. If it's a longer thought, it should be a longer paragraph. Now, if it's really long, then it's probably a couple different thoughts. Break it up. Right? Your headings, that's a group of thoughts. That's a group of thoughts, right? So each main point should get its own heading. Your opening should equal your closing. So the first sentence out of the gate is the very first sentence of the paper is an interesting fact, an interesting story, an interesting idea, an impassioned quotation, something that grabs my attention, that flair that Chris talked about, right? And then you build down to where, okay, from that broader, like that story, that less specific story, then you build to, okay, here's my thesis, and here are the main points I'm going to build in this paper. And then your closing is going to rephrase that thesis, is going to review your main points instead of previewing those main points. And then it's going to ideally bring us back to the thing that got our attention in the first place. What happened with that customer who found out that Wells Fargo was the one that stole her identity? Leave me with a cliffhanger in the intro and then wrap it up in the conclusion. Right? Is she satisfied with the reforms that Wells Fargo has undertaken? Right? Or if that story was, while it was still in the mid scandal, right? Your last sentence could be, hopefully, hopefully Ms. Sunday Paw doesn't have to worry about whether accounts are going to be created in her name fraudulently going forward. Right. So you bring us back to the thing that got our attention at the beginning. And then check for your voice. Are you talking about a subject or informing concisely? Right. Professional tone, professional voice, efficient writing. That's your voice, your goal for your voice. Now, because it's 2021, I'm going to discourage you from being super stodgy and detached. And, when one looks at a situation like this, one might be inclined to think, right, you can say you or I think, etc. But when you're doing that, that's probably a sign that you should probably be limiting that for the most part. But the kind of essay where that would fit in is totally good. That's what we're looking for, is not super stodgy, but formal enough that if this got emailed to your first to the hiring manager for your first professional job interview, you'd be like, yeah, I stand behind this. Make sure your citations have some uniformity. You want them alphabetized. You want the hanging indent style that you see in Charles's essay. You want your citation to be name first. All this is clear in Purdue OWL. You should at least know MLA or Chicago or something reasonably well by this point. Grammar is not just for decoration, like, oh, it's ugly when we have grammar problems. It's that I don't know what you're saying. Right. So if you have unclear grammar to the point where I'm unsure what your argument is, that's a problem. That's a real problem. Spelling. Again, check your spelling errors. Microsoft Word will help you with this. But you may be using the wrong word and spell it correctly. And then make sure you add a title page. Charles and I both recommend Pexels, pexels.com. It's a great source. It's all open source photos. You can use them for anything. You can take a photo off of Pexels and put it on a billboard on I-25, and you would owe nobody anything. So that's what fully open source, like Creative Commons Zero license, means. So you can use any of these photos any way you want. And here's his references. So we've got a few minutes left for questions. Any thoughts? Anything I can help with?
So I have a quick question. Where's the questions are located?
Sure. So if you look in your textbook, each of the cases is going to have the questions for discussion at the back of the case just before the sources. So here's Wells Fargo, right? It's not, it won't show to you because I've got my background on, sorry.
So in the end of the chapter or in the end of the case study, it shows that questions for discussion. Is that?
Yes. Okay. Yes. That's so the 3 questions for discussion, you want to answer 1, 2, or 3 of those questions for one case for each essay.
Okay, perfect. Thank
Yes.
you. And it's due February 26th, correct?
I believe. Check the syllabus.
Yeah.
So like a week from Friday, I believe.
So we are answering 1 or 3, or
As a default. As a default. So if you're not sure how many questions to answer one question. And let me give you an example. Let me give you an example of what I mean by that. If you look at case 9, a lot of you are going to want to answer case 9 because it's about the NCAA. And if you like, if you like March Madness, if you like college football, like great, that's easy. I want to talk about that. It's not an easy question. It's not any easier to answer than any of the other ones, but it gets a lot hard. It's a lot more difficult for you if you try to answer more than one question in this case. If you take the NCAA case, answer one question. That's my unsolicited advice to you. I'll still grade your essay if you answer 3. But listen to these questions. 1, how does the NCAA encourage collegiate football programs to develop a culture of ethics and compliance? Man, answering that well in just 4 pages, just that one question, answering that one question in 4 pages is going to be very difficult for you to do well. Right? I would want 10 pages to answer that question. 4 is going to be very difficult. 2, is it a valid criticism that the NCAA is based more on compliance than ethical values? Again, I would want a chapter worth of pages to write about that. Right? But if you want to answer, you can answer that pretty well in 4 pages though. So, but only that one. I would stick with just that one. If you want to talk about basketball, don't talk about question 1, talk about question 2, because question 1 is about football. Question 3, how can student athletes, coaches, and university administrators demonstrate a proactive response to ethics and compliance? Now, for those of you who are athletes and are interested in staying involved in that world, I suggest to you answer question 3 here and start thinking about this from the perspective of student athletes, coaches, and administrators at a university level, because compliance with NCAA policies for athletic programs is a huge job growth, is a huge industry, is a huge area of growth for jobs. They're always looking for people who can do this stuff. And so if you start being able to think about this stuff and put this out on your head, and then maybe go intern in that, with our athletics department, or another, maybe like a more big time athletics department, like a Division I school, you're on your way towards having a job in that field. And there's lots of demand for that. So if you're interested in that, answer question 3 and only question 3, and leave the other 2 alone. Simonis.
Just a quick question regarding personal anecdotes. Is it okay to use very limited personal experience, or we prefer kind of separate ourselves from the paper?
They're not going to count as evidence. They're not going to count as evidence. I want you to go find objective sources by professional writers or scholars who talk about the issues, right? But your personal story might make for a compelling introduction / conclusion. So that's probably the most appropriate place to use it. But in the heart of the essay, it's going to be really hard to find a way to do that that is well justified, that in terms of actually helping you prove the case in a really solid sort of way, versus getting my attention. Like if somebody, if Wells Fargo, you can't do Wells Fargo because Charles did it, and that's our example. But if you did Wells Fargo, and you had your identity, you were one of these customers who had an account created in your name, and what did you do about it? That's sure, get my attention that way.
Did you say anything about adding photos throughout this, or is this strictly text?
It's nice to have a photo on the cover page just for decorative purposes. Even that's not required. That's your spell check it before that, and spell checking is your last to do. So it's not an urgent at all. But
okay, so if anything, just the title page.
Yeah, if anything, just the title page. Now, if there's a graph from a journal article or from a periodical that helps you illustrate the point, right? 1, maybe 2, right? Thrown into the paper to illustrate that. Make it as long as if you need a whole page to show it to me, that's right? But if, like an eighth of a page worth of space is this graph really illustrates what I'm talking about. You include something like that to highlight some statistics or a trend or something like that. That could work, but for the most part, no. I mean, nobody really used photos the last semester, and that was good. That was as it should have been, except the title page.
And will this presentation be available on Canvas later, just to review during the
Yes.
writing process? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll post the recording that Charles did and the one that we're doing right now, and I'll put the slide deck up there as well.
All right.
Do you want us to stick to MLA or APA or any of those writing styles?
Chicago is great. If you're indifferent, I would encourage you to choose Chicago, because if you look at how anything public facing that a corporation produces, they use footnotes. They don't use in-text citation. And so I would encourage you to start doing that way if it's not a big difference to you. But this is, I mean, like, most of you will have learned how to use MLA and probably still have kept that through most of your writing. And so that's going to be more comfortable for most of you. So MLA is great. I dream in APA. I've been writing in APA for 20 years. So APA is great. I'll take APA any day. But any of those three is fine. And if you're going to use something obscure just because for somehow you wind up using Turabian or Harvard, I swear to God, there are hundreds of these things. Just give me a quick heads up that that's what it is I'm looking for, just so that in case something trips me up about this doesn't look like a citation at all. Well, it is according to this style. Just even in an email to me or something, just let me know this is cited. I'm going to cite my paper in such and such. I'm sorry, I had an English teacher at such and such state university that made me use this obscure citation style, and I'm just really comfortable with. Fine, great. I'll learn it real quick just to figure out what it is that you're doing. Anything that you're good with, as long as it's reasonably close to an established style, we're good. We're a little bit over. It's my office hours. I'll stay on and keep taking questions if folks have questions.
Yes, I have a question. So do I need to read the whole case from the beginning until the end in order to do the? Okay.
But not all of the cases. Do not try to read 20 cases to do this paper.
Oh no, I know what I'm gonna pick. So I already picked mine, which is case, where is it? Walmart case 7.
Sure. Yeah. So you are going to want to read the whole case as it's in the textbook, because that's going to give you a tremendous amount of background information, and take notes as you're reading it, and say, oh, here's what we already know, and here's what else I want to go learn more about. But if you read the questions first before you read the case, and especially if you read the questions that have a sense of, oh, this is the question I want to drill down on, then some of the case you'll read in a lot of detail because it'll really answer that question. And some of the case you can really skim through because it's like, oh, it's talking about the other questions. It's not really relevant to the one I'm on. So you don't necessarily have to read the whole thing very closely, but you will want to read the whole thing.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Should we be using the book as one of our sources?
It does not count towards your minimum source count, but if you cite the book, which you are welcome to do, cite it like any source.
Quick question regarding the sources. If one of the sources you plan on using is not in English, is it okay to use it without an official translation if it's very small?
Sure. If it's not essential to your paper, but it somehow is like, for that one particular point, is like, this is the best one I can find, and it's in a language I speak. Let me translate it for you. Yeah, and then you can indicate that in the citation that it was translated by me. You shouldn't need non-English sources, but.
Well, I just want to say thank you and have a good day.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. If we don't have any more questions, thanks so much. Have a good day. Like I said, I'll post this I'll put the slide deck up like right away, and the video as soon as I can get it edited and posted.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor.
Thank
Thanks a lot.
you.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
We can email you, right? If we have more questions.
Please do. Please email me and copy Charles Williams as well, and then whoever can answer it fastest, we'll get back to you.
Okay, thank you so much.